Remember, a few years ago, Greenpeace released a video with a KitKat chocolate with a orangutan finger in it, which made a very clear statement that much of the palm oil Nestlé, that owns the company KitKat, was coming from deforested plots in Indonesia, which were the home of orangutans. And before that, there was a scandal on teak garden furniture, which in the 90s suddenly, a lot of European households had teak garden furniture in their backyard or in the balconies. And most of that wood came from illegal logging in Cambodja, smuggled over the border by ex-Red Khmer into the furniture industry in Vietnam. So what do you do as a company when you're hit hard by a supply chain scandal like this? In both cases, these companies called our guest of today to help fix it. Not their public image, but their actual supply chain. Get traceability in, no-deforestation rules and monitoring, social programs, etc. Learn from the fascinating journey of today's guest of a forester born in Australia who founded the Forest Trust, which is now known as the Earthworm Foundation. Regeneration, socially, economically, and environmentally at scale. And learn why he is so excited about biochar.
This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, Investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investing-in-regenag. That is gumroad.com/investing-in-regenag, or find the link below.
Welcome to another episode, today with the founder of the Forest Trust, and he keeps inspiring businesses and NGOs to find innovative solutions. Welcome, Scott.
G'day, Karen. How are you?
I'm very, very good. I mean, that intro is, I always like to do the short ones, but this is like an understatement, and it's not covering at all what you have been up to in your career. What are you up to at the moment? So I'm very happy to have you here. Intro came through, fan of the show, Joram, so shout out if he's listening to this, which I think he will. And this is finally happening, which I'm excited about. We've had, so the Forest Trust, for people change names into Earthworm Foundation, which maybe many in the Regen Ag space have heard about as well, which we've covered with Bastien, which I will link below, but you've been at the birth of that a while ago. So I'm going to ask the personal question I always like to ask everyone. How come you spend most of your, let's say, awake hours focusing on soil and trees, of course? Like, how did that happen? Did you grow up in a forest? Did you fall into that rabbit hole? What happened there?
Yeah, I grew up in rural Australia, just outside of Melbourne. I mean, now where I grew up, is the suburban sprawl has gone way past it. So, but when I was there, it was a little country town with dirt roads and, one small shop, and surrounded by farms. There's a lot of horses there, horses and cattle, a lot of market gardens, actually, very rich soils. We had we had a 1/4 acre block where we had chickens and ducks, and we had.
When you say market gardens, you mean also the people were marketing that
for vegetables? Yeah, we call them market gardens in Australia. Like they're making big vegetable farms. Basically, there was a big swamp, not so much where I lived, but further down. Used to be a big delta area, ancient delta area, and so there's some wonderful black soils, very rich soils, and there was a lot of vegetable growing there for the whole of Australia, really. It's a huge area of soil, and they used to have, and they still have, but so much of the soil was drained, and the swamps were drained for the farming, but they have the world's largest earthworms there, would you believe, up to over a metre long. And yeah, it's an area called Southwest Gippsland. Massive earthworms, and they have, in typical Australian fashion, we have places where you can go as tourists, and we have, giant lobsters, giant sheep, and we have a giant earthworm not far from where I grew up. So yeah, earthworms and things like that were pretty important, but some of it to me were forests. So I spent a lot of time. We did move around as well as a family into other parts of that southeastern corner of Australia. And forests just seem to be an important place for me. And I just love being in them. And being in nature was I just grew up. My parents in those days, wasn't a lot of parental control. We just were allowed to wander freely. I had 4 dogs. I used to go out all the time, just wandering about with the dogs, and it was a lot of fun. So found a deep connection to nature, and famously tell this story about, I don't know what I was doing inside, but it was one Sunday afternoon. I went inside and the radio was on, which was strange. And on the radio was this ancient forester, British forester called Richard St. Barbe Baker. And there was this beautiful music coming on, and there was his voice, and he sounded like, I just heard his voice. I thought, God, that must be like what an oak tree sounds like. And he just captured me with his story, about a half-hour broadcast on the radio of this old man's life. He was 89 at the time, travelling around the world, trying to save forests, inspire children to plant trees. And this half an hour, 2 minutes into this half-hour broadcast, I knew that I was not going to be a vet, which had been my plan at that stage. I was just turned 15. I was going to be a forester like him. And so that was what set me off on my path.
Wow. Imagine the impact of a short audio clip. I'm not saying podcast because it was not at the time. Have you been able to find that recording?
I have. It's funny, what you should say about that. And it was one of these things that I listened to it once, and it literally just transformed my life on a scale, not just a little bit. It was one of those absolutely life-defining moments. And it was broadcast on the ABC radio in Australia. And some years later, like 30 plus years later, I listened, it was on the show called The Science Show, and it was broadcast every Sunday. And of course now they have the Science Show podcast where you can listen to it later. And so I was listening to the Science Show podcast, and this program with St. Barbe Baker was broadcast in 1979. And here was the host, the same host, Robin Williams, a magnificent man. And he said, we're going to go back into our archive and play a interview from 1973. And I'm like, well, if they've got 1973, surely they must have this interview with St. Barbe Baker. So I wrote to Robin Williams and I said, look, this show changed my life. I was wondering if you've still got the recording. And he's a lovely guy, and he wrote back to me, he said, well, you must be more careful about what we broadcast in the future. And he shared it with me. And it was one of those things. I was actually with Bastian travelling to Milan on the train, and we had a meeting down there.
Which passes right under here.
Right under where you are. So it's funny. And I had it, and I'd had that recording for about 2 weeks, but I wasn't courageous enough to listen to it.
I know, because imagine if it's like completely different.
Completely different.
Or way okay. So what made you decide to do it then, to re-listen?
Well, I knew I needed to. I knew I needed to, but I just was worried that, a bit like a movie, you see a movie and you come out and some years later you say, remember that scene? And you just get everything conflated, and it didn't really happen. And I thought, I've listened to this broadcast, and imagine if I don't know, I brought in ideas from somewhere else, or I just made it up. And so I just knew I had to. And so Bastian and I had been on the train. We'd had our meeting. We were coming back, and I just thought, right. So I put on my earphones, opened up the computer, and pressed play, and it was fantastic. And it was exactly as I remembered it. It was almost like I was listening to it again all those years, 33 years earlier. Just the same impact that it had on me. And I remember listening to it and just tingling all over, like, wow, that was really amazing. So it really changed my life.
Fascinating. And what, was it of course we cannot unpack that, but was he outside somewhere? You said it sounded like an oak tree, but it was his voice. Have you searched for other pieces of him as well to unpack that more? Like what do you think, without going into the pieces, because this is not something we can analyze, but what do you think was the trigger there? What really pulled you in completely? Apart from the fact that the radio wasn't on very often, but so it was interesting to hear something. But what was the trigger or the hook, or what do you think later, analyzing this, of course, with our rational mind? But
Yeah. Well, two things happened. The first is when I first listened to it, and my dad was a great fan of classical music. So as I walked in there was this beautiful classical music playing. And I've since met Robin Williams, the host, and also the guy who interviewed him, a wonderful man called Barry Oldfield, had invited St. Bar Baker to come to Australia, and he interviewed him. And he also was into classical music. So Robin had this beautiful music. And I just thought, it just captured me. And then the voice came, and this ancient voice, and I just thought, God, that sounds like an oak tree would speak. And of course, we didn't have things like Lord of the Rings and the Ents at that stage. We had the book, but we didn't have the movie. And I just thought, wow, that's an oak tree. And this old man just told these stories. And I wanted to, young fella, as I say, I was just 15, 3 days after my 15th birthday, I wanted to go overseas. And he just told these incredible stories of his life in the Sahara Desert. And the really thing that got me, it was about 20 minutes into the interview. And it's actually why, it's one of the main reasons why Earthworm Foundation is now called Earthworm Foundation, is that he told this story about planting trees in the Sahara Desert and in the Judean hills. And he would do and he described this thing called stone mulching. And next to every tree that the community would plant as they were trying to do reforestation, they would put 1 or 2 stones. And he told this incredible story about how with the heat, the sun would bear down on the stone and it would draw moisture up from below. And in the daytime, the worms would go down, and in the evening, they would come up and enjoy the moisture under the stone. And of course, because the worms were going up and down, they were bringing nutrients and water and their magical bacteria. And he said, if you lifted up the stone, you would see 1 or 2 earthworms under each stone. And then he said, but the thing is, if a goat got in there and knocked away the stone, the tree would die. And that was the moment when I'm thinking, how tenuous, this community's done all its work to grow the seedlings, to plant them. They go out there in this harsh environment, they put the stones, and then a goat comes in and knocks it away and everything dies. And I thought, it was that moment where I realised, firstly, the first thing that came to me was like, where did the earthworms come from? In the Sahara Desert.
In the Sahara Desert.
Where did those earthworms come from? And in the Judean hills. And that's baffled me to this day. But the second thing was like, who's talking to the goat herder? Someone needs to have a chat to the goat herder, because if the goat herder keeps the goats away, we're going to have a plantation of nice, new forest. If the goat herder lets the goats get in there, all the effort is wasted. So it started a lifelong journey of talking to goat herders, not literally goat herders, of course, but people who are pivotal, disruptors, people who are pivotal in making things work. And so when TFT started working a lot beyond forests, and we were thinking of a new name, I actually came up with Earthworm in about 2012, but we just couldn't get it through the organisation. There was half the people liked it, half the people didn't. But Bastian pushed it through when he became CEO.
Fascinating. Yeah, there are so many pieces there. Like, where do the earthworms come from?
Yeah.
And are there small eggs just everywhere waiting for the right circumstances? Like seeds are just waiting for sometimes very long time for the right circumstances to sprout. And seen people on farms and fields that have been doused in chemicals for 3, 4, 5 decades, and then they stop and they plant some productive trees and they put a bit of maybe some drip irrigation, etc. And suddenly the weeds explode, and you're like,
yes.
Where did they come from?
Where did that happen?
How did that happen? And they were just waiting. They were just yes. Not our time. Let's not go. But earthworm, that feels a different category, as in animals, but apparently they get dropped or they get there and they wait. And
it was always fascinating, and just hold this concept of the earthworm bringing life, that bringing nutrients, bringing life to the soil and to that tree. It's just so the rock, the earthworm, the people, the goats, the shade, an ecosystem of action to try and get those trees to grow. That fascinated me.
How did people find out that the stone attracts the earthworm, or the stones around the tree help with life, bringing life to the tree?
Ancient technology, and I don't know how St Barbe Baker knew about it, but they've since found it on Easter Island, would you believe? In the agriculture that people were practicing there, they would use stones to put in the fields to protect the crops from the sun, to give the soil some cover. And so it's ancient technology. St Barbe Baker must have learnt about it somewhere.
Fascinating. And then you cover the soil with something that reflects and heats up and not too much, and then
protects the moisture.
The moisture protected, which attracts the earthworms, which cycle the moisture and the nutrients, and by doing so do their magic and create soil.
Brilliant.
And with that, giving the tree roots places to go and in the desert. I mean, I think we've seen some fascinating examples. Not enough. I think, unfortunately, many of those haven't been captured visually. Let's say, so haven't made it into to YouTube videos, etc. I remember one of Neil Spackman doing a fascinating permaculture project in the Saudi Arabian desert. Like if you wouldn't have seen the pictures, you wouldn't believe it. That's with that limited amount of rainfall and that limited amount of what they were able to do. But showing that, like, and ancient technology, like, we know it's possible. The question is if we do it, and who talks to the goat herders, let's say. So yes. From then, you were 15. What your life changed at that moment? I mean, looking back, we know. But at that moment, what did you do?
Well, I realised I had to go at that stage, I didn't even know forestry was a subject that you could do at university. So I learned that there were 2 universities in Australia that offered forestry. One was in Melbourne, one was in Canberra. So I said, right, I've got to get the marks to get into that. So that gave me a target, and got into forestry school. Didn't have any money, so I worked for a couple of years in Melbourne at a medical research laboratory. Had a great time, and then went to Canberra. I got into Melbourne, got into Canberra, but I decided I needed to get away. I'd grown up on the outskirts of Melbourne, needed to get away, worked in Melbourne. So I went to Canberra, did my degree there, was absolutely blessed because, and it was, again, a great believer in the universe. I think by going to Canberra, what I didn't realise in choosing Canberra over Melbourne was that they had a community forestry project in Nepal. And so I went there to study forestry. And then
you basically picked it because it was not Melbourne.
I picked it because it wasn't Melbourne. And because when I got there, I learned that they had this amazing community forestry project and that there were opportunities for summer internships. One guy did it ahead of me, and I was talking to him when he'd come back. I said, what did you do over the summer? He said, oh, well, I was in Nepal. How did that happen? And he told me. So I'm like straight in to see the professor the next day. I'd love to do that next year. And sure enough, I was able to do it. And it was great because I had this dream of doing the work that St Barbe spoke about. But young bloke from the bush in Australia, was I going to be up to it? Would I enjoy it? So flew to Nepal for 3 months and just had another amazing experience there, working to try and understand the growth rate of fodder trees because the farmers didn't have fertilisers. So what they would do would be feed the leaves from their trees on their farms that were growing on the terraces to their animals, to their goats, their buffaloes. And then they would capture all the manure and put that into their soils. And so the trees in that ecosystem were really important, but no one really knew much about them. So the project manager said, could you go out and measure the trees and take cores to see if we can see how old they are, because then we can work out how fast they're growing, and we might be able to match that with some nutrient studies of the leaves. And so young bloke, and I had a colleague with me, we spent 3 months walking up and down the middle hills of Nepal, measuring trees and taking cores out. Subsequently took them back to Canberra and studied them, and
cores basically mean small drill.
Small drill, yeah, like a little straw. We'd put them in a straw, so literally like a straw. So it didn't damage the tree. I mean, it was putting a hole in the tree, but it didn't really hurt the tree, and that closed up afterwards. And sanded them off, counted the growth rings, worked out what were growth rings because no study had ever been done on many of these trees before. So it was a real adventure of learning. Gave them the results, and they learnt about how fast these fodder trees were growing, and that meant that they could, prioritise the faster growing ones in certain areas, ones with better nutrients. But what an experience, young bloke from the bush, never been outside Australia. And here I am in Nepal, and of course got giardia, got all the stomach sicknesses you can get. But because we had to go up into the high country, we lived with a family up there. We had to go down into the low country. We lived with a family down there. So we had all the animals, all the Nepalese food. And what an experience, mate. Just changed my life again.
And I think for many, besides that experience, also the tree fodder thing or concept is a bit foreign, I think, to many, let's say, industrialized agriculture countries. Like, animals like to eat leaves, especially fresh one from trees, in certain amounts, with certain nutrients, certain moments of the year, not always at the same time, etc. I see that pioneering farmers are starting to rediscover that, or in agroforestry systems. And of course, scared by damaging the tree. But in this case, the tree is a fundamental piece for the nutrient cycle of the animals, of course, getting a manure, and that can go into the field. So that whole fodder piece, I noticed, or tree hay, or whatever we want to call it, is something that I just wanted to double click on that and make sure people realize how important that is and how important it will be, because you use the vertical space. Let's say ruminants are not just growing on grass and pasture. There's a whole other vertical space we ought to be using, and animals love it. You see them climbing to weird heights to get to certain leaves in certain moments.
That's right.
And that was studying and then what led you to the trees?
Yeah, so I finished my degree. Didn't publish it, but I completed the study of the Nepalese work, and then needed to get some experience in Australia, because the message coming from the project in Nepal and similar projects was that they were also sending their forestry students overseas. So it's not just some white guy turning up and sorting out these problems. They actually had some highly qualified foresters in their own countries, and we'd studied with some of them. Some of the Nepalese foresters had come to ANU. So the message was, get out into the bush and get yourself some experience. And so I got a job in forestry in Tasmania, which was another fantastic experience, but very different. It was, in large natural forest management, but also plantation forest management, large scale forest management, fires, all sorts of things, but living in a small community in a remote part of northeastern Tasmania. Did that for a couple of years. Great experience.
Just for people to make it visual, like, what does Tasmania look like? I don't think many people have been, unfortunately. Not saying that's not a bad thing, but just Nepal, I don't know, somehow I can imagine it, but Tasmania, not really. Like, what kind of trees, hilly, not hilly, what does it look, what does it feel and smell like?
Yeah, so quite different from the Australian mainland. It does have the agricultural land that we're used to seeing pictures of Australian sheep farms and things like that. Yeah, so in the west of Tasmania, they have these amazing, it's an incredible wilderness area. I don't know the highest mountain. I used to know that, but I can't remember, maybe about 1,500 metres, not sure. But beautiful wild areas with the winds hit Tasmania from Tierra del Fuego, basically. It's at such a southern latitude that it misses the south of Africa and just comes right across. So they've got an air monitoring station on the west coast of Tasmania to monitor the cleanliness of the world's air, because they feel that that's the cleanest air in the world, because there's no pollution. There's no pollution. But on the east coast, it's a little bit more. I mean, there are some mountains. Sort of singular mountains and a bit of highland country, but all covered in the mountains, eucalyptus forest, so big trees. In the southwest, there's some massive trees, tallest hardwood trees in the world, Eucalyptus regnans. There's rainforest. On the west coast, a lot of temperate rainforest, beautiful rainforest.
Wow.
So just a magic place. And in the middle, you have the valleys where you have the sheep farms and the cattle farms and things like that, the more traditional Australian landscape from the mainland. But a microcosm of its own unique little place, Tasmania. Very much worth a visit.
Guess it's the longest piece. And so you said, I spent a few years there. Like, what did you do and how... And what made you leave, actually? Because it sounds like a magical place. and there was a moment to leave and to go into, I think, the rest of the world, because I don't think you stayed in Australia. What made you, what did you do there? Sorry, as a first question, and what made you leave?
Yeah, so, St. Barb's words were burning in my heart, basically, about, working overseas. And so Tasmania was great. I spent a lot of wonderful times there, great friends. I also learned that those foresters from Nepal and other countries were now getting masters. So if I wanted to get a job overseas, I had to get a master's. And again, I often talk about, fate and the universe. Well, one day I came in from being out in the bush in Tasmania, and on my desk was an application for a scholarship to study a master's in forestry at Oxford. And I applied. It was only for foresters working in state forest services. So I was one of only 7 applicants in the whole of Australia. Wow. People say, "Oh, you must be clever. You must be smart. You got a scholarship to Oxford." It's like, no, I was just lucky. Only one.
It was a nice criteria that not many people were able to.
1 out of 7. I was 1 out of 7, and of course I was able to get a reference from the professor at ANU Forestry for the work that I'd done overseas, and that helped. So I got a master's, went to Oxford, had an incredible experience there, met my wife, she was on the same course, also a forester, and did that course, came back to Tasmania for a short while, but was burning to get overseas, and applied for the job in Nepal to be a forester on that project again. Didn't get it because one of the people who had been on that project decided that he wanted to go back, and of course he was great, he had the experience, he spoke the language. So I didn't get that. But the company that was running the project at that stage, it was no longer the university, realised that he was a young forester keen to get overseas. And about a month later, they rang me up and said, "Well, we've got a project in the Mekong Delta, a research project, reforestation research project. Would you be interested?" And I'm like, "Absolutely, yes." And they said, "Well, we better tell you a bit about it first." I'm like, "Okay, go and tell me." And so they did tell me, and it was the opportunity to get started as a young forester. Quite difficult to get into that work. So it was in the depths of the Mekong Delta, right near the border with Cambodia. The Vietnamese government, after the war in 1975, had sent the South Vietnamese army into the Mekong Delta re-education camps, basically, to clear the swamp forests and to plant rice. And that had largely worked. And today Vietnam is, I think, the second largest rice exporter in the world. But what in the area where I was, it hadn't worked because these were acid sulfate soils, with the potential acid sulfate soils. And so when they drained them, they cleared the trees and they built the drains, they exposed this layer of, now I can't remember, it's such a long time ago, jarosite, I believe. When they exposed this tiny little layer of jarosite that existed at various depths in the soil, usually between 0 and 1 metre, it would oxidize and became pyrite. It may have been pyrite becoming jarosite. There'll be soil scientists out there that know more about that than me. But in that process, it would release sulfuric acid into the soil. And so this incredible Garden of Eden, which was forests and fish and birds that the Vietnamese army, the Viet Cong had been in to fight against the Americans and had been bombed mercilessly, was now cleared. And everything died because the pH dropped from, beautiful 7 Garden of Eden place down to 2 and 2.5. Wow. So all of the rice that they planted in that 150,000 hectare area died. They tried and tried. They didn't get anywhere. And the Vietnamese government asked for a project to try and get the trees back. And the Australian government... Because they realised it was the trees, or what was the realisation? They just realised that, if they were going to have an economic benefit there, the farmers were moving out there, but they couldn't grow rice. And they realised that in time, the soil would ameliorate, but it might take 30 years. So what are the farmers going to do in the meantime? Well, what about planting some trees? And this could perhaps ameliorate some of the soil conditions too. But they couldn't get the trees to grow back either because because of the acid, because of the flooding. Every year, the delta the Mekong would flood. So they were looking to plant eucalyptus because there's timber to be had, but they couldn't handle the flooding. And, in some areas, the flooding was over 2 metres. And so as a young forester, it was my job. I was replacing another young forester who had started the project. And I was asked to go out there because he needed to leave. He wanted to go back to Australia with his family. So I went out there and just, experience, this amazing working with the farmers, understanding what were their problems, how do we get trees back, what was happening with their rice. I wasn't doing anything on the agricultural side. It was all trees, but that was trees very much linked in with with what they were trying to do on the agricultural side. So it was my first taste of, this was 1993, so it was my first taste of agroforestry in those days. Yeah, quite fascinating.
And what happened, or what did you manage to facilitate there in terms of change, or in terms of differences? What did you experience?
Yeah, well, the farmers were busy planting eucalyptus wherever they could, but when the floods came, and they were planting eucalyptus species that could cope with a bit of wet feet. But what we realised was they just had to go back to the natural forest species, the Melaleuca trees that were there, swamp forest, and they could plant eucalyptus on the mounds of the canals, and that would get them up out of the water. So they could plant eucalyptus, but they needed to plant Melaleuca. And so we did some trials on some different species that they could look at, but ultimately it was the Melaleuca species that grew there before they chopped it all down that seemed to be able to cope with the acid. It struggled a bit, but we really established that, here's how you do it. Here's how you can get the trees established. This is what you need to do to help them get up and running. Here's what you can do for some eucalyptus, and just mix that in with your farmland. And so, it worked, and basically became a new model for that landscape, that 150,000 hectare landscape of mixing trees in with the rice, and it seemed to help the farmers get up and running. So. But again, another amazing experience of, all the sicknesses you can imagine. I was out working with farmers all the time, drinking a lot of rice wine, staying in their houses because I had to go out and measure the trees every few weeks. And what a rich experience of learning about the Vietnamese people and their culture. And so the project was a success, but what it really meant was that my career in overseas forestry, which is what I'd wanted. Hard to leave Tasmania. It was so beautiful, but that was my path. And so when I finished the project there in September 1995, instead of going back to Tasmania, I went to Canberra again, where the consulting company who'd run the project was based, and they said, "We'll give you a job, and you can work again in these projects." So that's how I ended up really moving into that overseas forestry.
And how normal was it at the time to look at the traditional trees, or the natural trees that used to be there? Was it a big step, or was it very like in forestry that like if everything else, or if the eucalyptus doesn't work because of the flood, and other species are struggling because of the acidity, it was a natural step to go there to that type of trees, or was it quite a stretch?
It was pretty natural. What we did do was look at other species. We bought some species from Australia that we could try, that might have been able to go better than the local species. Some of them did grow faster, but ultimately the hardy, after a few years, those trials showed that the local species might have grown a little bit slower, but it was very, very tough and resilient. And so that's ended up what happening, And so I think foresters, we get excited. We think we can bring something in, and there's big question marks about whether that was a wise thing to do now, bringing another species in from Australia. It was the same genus, like it was Melaleuca, but it could have turned into if it had turned into a weed, the Vietnamese probably would have been happy, because it would have covered the areas that had been deforested, and they could use it for timber. So there wasn't so much worry about that, but ultimately the local species just proved the best.
Yeah, there's a fascinating, I think, philosophical discussion on weeds and invasive species.
That's right.
And like, does that even exist? And if there's a role for a species not from there that does thrive and provide timber and cover, etc., like, should we be the one saying, yeah, but it's not originally from here, but it's the same family, yeah, but it's different circumstances because we actually chop down everything and release an acid and fundamentally change the soil, so there might be another species. That's right. So there's I've known farmers saying, yeah, we don't really mind the weeds because it's the only thing that grows there.
That's right.
And my animals can eat it. I'm also fine, even though everybody else freaks out when they hear, isn't this weed, or isn't this term, or isn't this eucalyptus. Of course, there are places where they're actually banned, even though with the right management they thrive, the right types. I mean, it's always the context, but it's very interesting the mental frameworks we have around weeds and invasive species that somehow make us freak out constantly.
That's right, yeah.
And so what led you to found then TFT and the Forest Trust? Because you could have stayed, I don't know how long you stayed, but like in the consultancy company for sure, many interesting projects around the world, quote unquote easy. I'm not saying easy, but like a smooth path, or we could have been talking now and you would still be there. What made you to start your own thing?
So part of it was what I saw in Vietnam. Just as I was leaving Vietnam, a big Taiwanese company came in and said, well, we're going to plant all these eucalyptus here. We're going to plough up the soil and make mounds and plant the eucalyptus on mounds. And I was like, well, no, you wouldn't want to do that. That's not going to work. No, we're going to make massive mounds. We'll get the trees up out of the floods. And of course, when they did the mounding, they released more acid. The trees weren't out of the floods and the trees died. And here was this opportunity. And for the few months, literally it was months that they were there, they were pumping a lot of money into the local community, local economy, and what a great opportunity. But they didn't listen to the research, and the whole thing just was a disaster, which messed up the landscape even more. And I saw that and I thought, golly, there was a goat herder right there. If someone had spoken to that, well, I did speak to them, but the goat herder didn't listen. What if we could help companies do better? And that was a sort of thing that I held on to as I left Vietnam. And a lot of my consulting work was with companies, trying to help them do better. And as part of that, I met some forest managers who, in the FSC system, had just emerged, the Forest Stewardship Council for certifying forest management had emerged at that stage, and there was a forest manager in Asia who complained bitterly to me, saying, "Well, I've just had an audit, and they've told me all the things that I'm doing wrong, but they're not going. They can't help me solve it." And the perception was he was a forester who was just chopping down the trees, wasn't interested in good forest management. This was not the case. So again, I thought, well, here's an opportunity to help this person do better. Amongst all of that, so these are some of the threads that were coming together. Amongst all of that, the company that I was working with in Canberra wanted to open an office in the UK. Because I'd been to Oxford, I'd been to the UK, they said, well, you're the best qualified. So my wife and I moved back to the UK. And what happened that was in 1997. What happened in the summer of 1998 was that there was a massive campaign against garden furniture that was made in Vietnam, but all of the timber was found to be trucked over the border, ripped out of the forests of Cambodia, trucked over the border, over the mountains into Vietnam, made into furniture.
The teak scandal.
Yes, that's right. It was huge. And I had already been working on that as a consultant for a British do-it-yourself chain called B&Q. They had wanted to get their forest certified, and I said, well, not easy. And I discovered the fact that the logs that were being used in their furniture, this was in December 1995, were coming from Cambodia with all sorts of destructive links, environmental and human rights abuses. And the NGOs only sort of reported that 3 years later, by which time I was working a lot on this. And that led to the start of the TFT, where people said, you need to talk to that Scott Poynton person. He's doing something on garden furniture. And so, again, it came this thread of helping companies do better. And at the time, when companies found that something was wrong in their supply chain, that's my supplier. They just blamed their supplier. I'm just buying the furniture. I'm the good guy here. I'm the victim too. And I was like, no, you need to find out where that wood comes from and make sure that it's not linked to bad practice. And that's what happened. And that's what I was working on. And when the garden furniture campaign exploded, I was able to say, well, let's set up an organisation that can help companies do that. And it was really pioneering what people today call responsible sourcing. It didn't exist back then. We really pioneered this idea of you need to know what's going on in the upstream, far distant upstream reaches of your supply chain. You are responsible for it. You can influence it, and let's make it good. Let's make sure it's coming from well-managed forests. And so that was the impetus to set up TFT, and we set it up. I had a lot of discussions at the back end of 1998 and launched it in March 25th, 1999. So TFT just turned 25 years old. Well, now it's Earthworm Foundation, but yeah, the organisation just turned 25.
Wow. And just a fascinating thing that I'm not saying there wasn't like sustainable supply chain management before, but that it came through wood and garden furniture. Like that was the trigger. I mean, this wood was in a lot of other things as well. And we know a lot of other supply chains, especially from tropical countries, cacao, coffee, to just name a few, palm oil, are troubled. And somehow it triggered something when it was about our garden furniture. Have you thought about like why that was?
Yeah, look, it's funny too. It's a great question. That's funny. The NGOs had been working hard to raise concerns about mahogany furniture, but 0.01% of the maybe less of the population have a mahogany table, right? And so in the back end
and do they care?
And do they care? Exactly. And so all through the 90s, 80s and 90s, there was a lot of reports from NGOs around mahogany. It just didn't touch the consciousness of the masses. But what happened was around 1995, the world's largest wooden garden furniture company, Scancom, was born. It wasn't the largest then, but and they saw that they could go from teak, which was very expensive, high quality, high price garden furniture. They could do exactly the same designs, but they could use other tropical hardwoods that were beautiful, not as beautiful as teak, but it would drop the price down, to about 30 or 40%. And that started in 1995, which meant that there was this incredible explosion of demand across the whole of Europe. So just about everyone had one of these garden benches or chairs, even if they lived in a flat, they had a little chair on their patio or whatever. And so when the NGOs realised, they saw this explosion and said, what's going on? And Global Witness, for those of your listeners who have seen Blood Diamond, they were the NGOs behind the movie Blood Diamond. They focused on how conflict can be exacerbated through natural resource destruction. And they looked at timber coming from Cambodia. And it was all being done by the army, by the remnants of the Khmer Rouge. And they were trucking these logs over into Vietnam for making garden furniture, which landed in everyone's home. And so it was a magnificent opportunity when they hit the stores and the press. It touched everybody. And so suddenly it was really, and up until that stage, all the companies were going to meetings around, oh yes, we've got, Global Forest and Trade Network, we've got to be thoughtful about these things. And when I set up TFT, it was like, no, you guys have got to pay. It's the same way if you've got a problem with your computer, you invite someone in to fix it. If you can't fix it yourself, you pay for that service. Well, you've got an environmental and social crisis in your supply chain. You need someone to come and fix it for you. And we're not going to go to the EU and ask for donor money. This is your business. You have a business problem. And that was the key turning point. And in the first year of TFT, the founding members put $800,000 into the kitty to say, get out there and sort that out for us. It was the first time any company had ever spent such a significant amount of money on sorting out environmental and social issues in their supply chain at such a scale. I'm sure individual companies had done it here or there, but only out of the goodness of their heart. But this was the birth of the responsible sourcing movement, and companies just had to go down that path. And so the NGOs were saying, well, you're doing it for your wood. What about this? What about that? And so it came. It grew, and eventually, that led TFT to be working in palm oil and other commodities.
And it's fascinating the moment it hits your balcony or your terrace or your garden. Like you literally have basically blood on your balcony. Like then you have something to push. And at that time, because you said you discovered it 2-3 years before, like the time the scandal hit, and people started to realize and started to knock on your door, and then of course you found the TFT and the Forest Trust. Like, were there, I'm not saying solutions, but were you deep enough in it that you could at least discover or find pathways? Because trucking teak wood, even different quality, but over the border with the army and all of that, doesn't sound like an easy fix at all. But did you have enough potential pathways and options there to say, okay, these are the points to work on. These are the most difficult pieces, or let's go and get to work. Because when you need to get to some solutions. It's not that you can say to these companies, we have also no clue. Like, we're going to go there and maybe find out that it's impossible and we should all stop with teak wood. What were your answers to their questions?
Well, the last thing you said was exactly the first place I started, was like, we may not be able to sort this out, but we're going to go and have a look. And so I was unusual in that sense, where most service providers or consultants come and say, well, here's the 10 steps to sorting this out for you. And I was like, well, it might not be possible, but we're going to go and have a look. What had happened in December 95, when I started this process by going to visit a forest in around Ho Chi Minh City, where I learned that the logs were coming from Cambodia, and that was with a UK company, as I mentioned, B&Q, and they were like, oh, okay, we've got to stop. And I said, hold on. There's a factory there in Saigon which employs quite a lot of people, and you're 80% of their business. If you cancel your order with them, all those people are going to lose their job. And you know what? You don't have to be taking wood from Cambodia. There are other forests. There's forests in Vietnam that they're not certified, but with a bit of help, they could become certified. And this was the birth of the TFT model. Like, find someone, if you don't...
Like the one you talked to, the one that was very frustrated that he just got an audit. I'm assuming it's a he.
No, it was it was a different person. But what I said to B&Q was, don't cancel your orders. Let's just find another forest to anchor your supply chain. So the solution started to emerge. Like, let's find forests that you can buy wood from with confidence, that it's not coming from destruction and human rights abuses. Number one. Number two is, let's then put in traceability systems that we can be sure that that's the wood that's getting into your furniture. And so they said, okay, fine. So from 1996 to the crisis of 1998, I spent my time talking with the Vietnamese government, trying to find a forest that we could use to anchor that supply chain for B&Q. And in April of 1998, just as the campaign was about to start, I visited a forest in the Central Highlands, and they were like, yeah, we're keen. We can supply that timber into that sawmill, into that furniture factory in Ho Chi Minh City. And if you could give us some support, we can try and get ourselves better managed and certified. So, and then the rains came, so everything stopped. So I said to B&Q, when the rains finished in November, let's go back. And of course, in that intervening period, the garden furniture campaign absolutely exploded. And because I'd been working with WWF in Vietnam to identify this forest, people went to see WWF in Europe and said, because they were... The companies who were being attacked saw WWF and said, what can we do? And they said, I don't know, but maybe you should talk to Scott Poynton. And that's how the companies found me. And then talking to them, we said, well, let's get this forest up and running. You can we can fund some technical assistance in there. We can get some other forests. All the wood can come into the factories. We can put traceability systems in place, and you can send wood furniture to your customers in Europe that may not yet be certified, but we can show is on the path to becoming certified and eventually will become certified. So that was the dawn of the TFT model, which has been sort of carried through even to today with all of these commodities. Like, let's anchor the supply chain in a place that we can work with. Maybe it's already certified. It wasn't back then, but maybe today it could be. And then let's improve things, and let's put traceability in place to make sure that that's the raw material that ends up in that product. That was the dawn of the TFT model.
Yeah, and I think it's underappreciated, let's say, the role of traceability. We hear it a lot, etc. But in many supply chains, at least back in the day, and still we see now the forensic activity around the deforestation law in Europe. Like, many supply chains are quite complex, and it's not like you cannot guarantee, or you couldn't at the time, that none of your wood or none of your furniture that you sell in your shop in Oxford or Liverpool wasn't trucked over the border in Cambodia. Not because you didn't want to, but it just was never a question, nor
they never looked
real deep and never looked. But I think people might find it surprising how many of these things we actually don't know, or just haven't connected it all the way back to the source. And that's in eggs, and that's in animal protein, and in soy, and in wood, and in many of the other things. Like, it's it's not run like an Apple computer factory or something where they know exactly which bit goes in where, because it's just a different value in the supply. But most supply chains are pretty messy, to say the least.
That's right. And back then they were just outrageously bad. And people would, the furniture company would go to the factory to check the furniture. The fact that it was made of wood didn't seem to occur to them to ask where the wood came from. It wasn't their business until it was made their business by the NGOs. And of course, the same thing happened years later with the palm oil industry, where it was made their business because they were proven to be, palm oil was so linked to deforestation. And it was really that work that, TFT from, when we started in 1999, we worked only on wood. And that we went worldwide. We got forest certified in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, and we put in traceability systems, all of these things. But sitting in the back of a Hilux, bouncing across Cameroon with Bastien in the front in 2007.
A Hilux is a car.
Hilux, sorry, a big four-wheel drive Hilux.
One of these big pickup.
Big pickup.
Yeah.
Bastien was in the front talking to this guy. We were going to visit the forest that they were working on the other side of Cameroon. And the Stern review had come out in December 2006. And what it had identified was that deforestation was in fact second only to the energy industry of being the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And this was a big shock to me. And even worse, even a bigger shock was that the wood industry counted for very little of that. Most of it was, of course, deforestation for soy and palm oil. And here's this young forester following in the footsteps of St. Barbe Baker, thinking he's going to make a difference to forest conservation. And what the Stern review showed was that, it really, the wood industry, yes, sort of important, but really just a tiny little drop in the ocean compared to what was happening in the agricultural sector. And I'm sitting in the back of this Hilux bouncing around, and my French wasn't so good back then. So Bastien was chatting away with the fella from the company, and I had 7 hours of reflection. And like, this is not good. We've got this model of helping companies understand where their raw materials come from with traceability. We've got technical assistance to improve the management of where that comes from. We could apply this model to palm oil. We could apply it to soy. We could apply it to any product. I used to say we could apply it, flippantly, I used to say we could apply it to cheese from the moon. You just need to know where it comes from, what's going on out there, how it's sourced, what's happening in the factories where it's processed, because we weren't only interested in the environmental, we were interested in the social as well. No good having beautifully sourced raw materials if the workers in the factories were slave labour or child labour. So we looked at both, and that was how we ended up moving into palm oil.
And I mean, it's fascinating that realization that forests or forestry is such a small part. Partly maybe because there's an incentive there to keep the forest at least somehow standing in some kind of production way. Of course, plantation forests are very different than the natural forest, etc. But there's an interest in the trees. If the agriculture pressure rises, that the interest is just to get rid of it as soon as possible. And then there's a land use change. Of course, the carbon of the trees might get released, plus all the soil carbon or much of it gets released at some point through the plowing or disturbance, etc. And so what was the first project then in terms of, let's say, agriculture supply chains that you managed to start or to kickstart? Where did you go after that 7-hour realization? Okay, we need to do something.
Yeah.
Where was the first something to do?
Yeah, so we decided we'd look at both palm oil and soy, and we went to see supermarkets in...
Look, there's a scandal coming. We can guarantee you. And we know what to do when a scandal comes.
Exactly right. And so one of these supermarket members of TFT, who we'd sorted out the garden furniture for, they said, okay, why don't you have a look at the palm oil? And so we went out into the palm oil set. We looked at soy as well, but of course what we found was that I think it was something like 80% of the soy coming into Europe to feed the chickens that ended up in the supermarket shelf as chicken breasts and things like this was GMO. And this wasn't good news, obviously, for the supermarket chains. It wasn't a problem for the US, of course, but in Europe, GMOs is so just horrific for people that it was like, okay, let's not look at that. If people realise that the soy is GMO, then they'll stop buying our chicken breasts. What a crisis. And so let's look at palm oil instead. So we started looking at palm oil 2007. as we did that, all the palm oil industry guys were like, go away. You're the forest people. You're the furniture people. You're the timber people. We don't need to talk to you. What do you know about growing palm oil? And we said, well, we don't know anything about growing palm oil, but we do know about deforestation, and we do know about human rights abuses, and we know about traceability, and we think you've got a problem coming, and you might want to start acting on it. And we didn't really get very far. We learnt a lot. And then, of course, what happened was, again, another campaign, the Nestlé Greenpeace KitKat campaign.
With the fingers of the orangutan. The fingers of the
orangutan, exactly. Yeah. March 17th, 2010, the video went global at 12 o'clock, and the office worker, shredding the paper, opened the KitKat. There was the KitKat, the orangutan's finger, munching, blood coming out everywhere. Crisis. Nestlé handled it very badly, threatened legal action, which only made the video go more viral.
That's it. Like, why do companies still think that you can do that? I mean, they maybe severely underestimated virality, let's say, online, but that gets you anywhere. Like, people love to share stuff that's going to get banned maybe at some point. Like, that's like sort of like a child. Come on.
For Greenpeace, it was a gift, and off they went, and the whole thing just exploded. And Nestlé continued to handle it badly. And I'm watching this, and one of my sort of rules with TFT had been was we don't chase ambulances is the sort of term that's used. Like, when someone was getting beaten up by the NGOs, we didn't ring them up and say, we can help you. We didn't do that. But in the case of Nestlé, they were bunkered down over there, and because I live 45 minutes from Nestlé's headquarters, I know a lot of people who worked there and some senior people. And I said to them, listen, you are handling this so badly. If someone there wanted to have a chat, I'd be happy to go and do that. And they said, okay, we'll check. And they checked, and about 30 seconds later, the phone rang and said, could you come over? They were in trouble. And it was great, and they were good people. And I went over there and we spoke to the people there, and they were like, okay, what do we need to do? I said, okay, well, let's set up. You're getting beaten up for being linked to deforestation. Let's have a no deforestation commitment. Okay, what should we put in it? And it was great. It was a wonderful backwards and forwards process. And Greenpeace, they were meeting Greenpeace in about a week or so, and they'd had a couple of meetings with Greenpeace, which had gone very, very badly, very badly, because Nestlé was speaking Nestléese and Greenpeace was speaking Greenpeaceese. They were both speaking English, but one was businessese, one was NGOese, and they just missed each other completely. And the Nestlé guys sent me a presentation that they were going to use with their presentation with Greenpeace. I'm like, oh my God, do not do that. Do not say that. Do not say slide 1, slide 2. Anyway, helped them with that and wrote the world's first no deforestation commitment. They said, if you think that's what we should do, we'll do it. And I said, okay, well, let me just check with Greenpeace. Send it over to the guys at Greenpeace. They added a bit here and there, but it was effectively just 5 dot points. Be legal, protect high conservation value forests, protect this concept called high carbon stock forest, which was interesting because we didn't really know what that meant. Don't clear.
Did you make that up like there?
We made it up right there. With Greenpeace guys and asked them, because what it was, when a forest is...
Which is hilarious, like that moment of crisis, you sneak in something.
Exactly.
Probably we should do that.
Probably should do that.
Nobody checks at the moment, everybody's in panic mode. So
That's right. And so the Nestlé, everyone's like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, well, we don't know yet. But basically what we were trying to do is trying to find a threshold by which if you have an untouched forest down to grassland, there's a gradient, right, of how much the forest is degraded. And the concept of high carbon stock became, where do we draw the line in the sand, as it were, and say, beyond that, you can clear it because it's really not functioning as a forest anymore. But on the right side of that, it's still functioning as a forest. Let's protect it and it'll come back. So that was the concept of high carbon stock forest. But we didn't have a number of where that line in the sand was.
Yeah, but it's interesting you introduced the concept like not all forest is the same. Forest, no deforestation, if we want to continue to eat palm oil, might be impossible. So there is a line there. There's a continuum, and it's 50 shades of green, or forest cover, etc. And to understand also that this commodity is going to grow, and it has grown and exploded since then. So what to do, where and why, and what makes sense in this very full planet we're in. And to introduce that with an interesting name is of course fascinating.
Yeah, and that's what happened, and it was signed off. Nestlé announced it 2 weeks after I first met with them, and then the work to actually implement all that started. And so we were going out to the same companies who had more or less told us to, go away in very firm terms before Nestlé. And now we were sitting in the room with the world's largest food company saying, we've got this policy, we need to implement it. And they were saying, okay. And to their credit, Golden Agri Resources, Indonesia's largest palm oil company, which had been the company that had triggered the KitKat campaign, they said, well, we want to meet that policy. We believe we can meet it, because the policy was no clearing peatlands, protecting human rights of the communities, acting in a legal way, high carbon stock forest, high conservation value forest. And they said, we don't think we're doing any of the other things, but what do you mean by this high carbon stock forest thing? And we're like, good question, we don't know. So to their credit, again, mediated the dispute between them and Greenpeace, which was a big, ferocious campaign at that stage. And we said, let's get some research out there into some of these degraded forests, because the Indonesian forest landscape had been marred by the plywood industry since the 50s. And so there was a lot of degraded
forest. So wasn't that all of this was like pristine, full of orangutans of life? Like a lot of this was...
That's right. There was forest that was pristine, that was being chopped, but there was a lot of forest that had been mangled and brutalised by the plywood industry, going back again and again and again and again, 5 or 6 times. By the time the palm oil industry came along, these forests were... a lot of them were just destroyed anyway. And the palm oil company would come and clear it. But in doing so, they would also clear some pretty nice areas. And because these concessions were just being handed out from Jakarta, they didn't really know the condition of the forest. And so the companies were expert at knocking it down and planting palm trees. And so GAR said, well, we said to them, why don't we do some research? Let's go out and measure some of these trees and find out where this threshold line could be. And they went for that. And really it was 2 years of research that led to this sort of line in the sand. Meanwhile, the rest of the palm oil industry was dismayed and outraged by this. This was terrible. GAR, again, mediated their no deforestation commitment, forest conservation policy, which was launched on February the 9th, 2011, just after, so a few months after Nestlé's. And this set things in motion, but most of the companies just ignored it and said, we don't want to work with that. We got RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil Certification Initiative, and they sort of blocked progress. But meanwhile, GAR, Greenpeace and the TFT teams were out in the bush measuring these trees, getting some good science behind where this threshold number could be. And it was a fascinating process that eventually led to the release of this high carbon stock forest concept at 35 tonnes of standing carbon seemed to be a threshold that most people would agree that beyond that, just clear it, it's really destroyed. But anything above that needs to be protected. Then social issues started to come because a lot of the smallholders were saying, well, we've got this forest. This is our community forest. We would like to clear it and grow palm oil because we can make money. So this whole process started, which became the high carbon stock approach, sort of multi-stakeholder forum, and that's still going. Companies piled in. APP, which was Asia Pulp and Paper, which was the sister company of GAR, they came to us. They said, well, you've sorted out GAR. Can you help us? We've got Greenpeace hanging off our building. That took quite some time, but that worked. And they had a no deforestation policy. They got 2 million hectares of bulldozers out of 2 million hectares of forest. Then Wilmar, the world's largest palm oil company, said they were being attacked by an NGO.
Out of Singapore, I think.
Yeah, out of Singapore, Wilmar, world's largest palm oil company. They trade about 45% of the world's palm oil. And Glenn Horowitz, who now leads Mighty Earth, campaigning against, certainly the beef industry, but other industries. But Glenn led this campaign against Wilmar back in 2013 because the fires in Indonesia for establishing palm oil was choking Singapore. And there was a whole campaign there. And we already knew Wilmar because of the Nestlé connection. we got in there, worked with Wilmar, and December 5th, 2013, they launched their no deforestation policy, which was the first time a trader had committed to stamping out deforestation in their third-party suppliers. So a big process, a massive change process was unlocked from that moment of talking to Nestlé through to the end of 2013, where we had the biggest palm oil companies in the world, pulp and paper company in the world. And then in 2014, everyone had to follow because Wilmar was taking the market because they were a big player and they were moving towards no deforestation. And so all of their customers who bought palm oil from them and others moved their orders to Wilmar because they realised that they didn't want to be linked to deforestation as well. So Wilmar did pretty well business-wise, but to their credit, they worked very hard to implement the policy as well.
And so where does it leave us now in 2024? What do you see in the palm oil? We'll get to other places, but see in the palm oil industry. What gives you hope? What scares you? What's the current state? If you can say that.
Yeah, well, amazingly, and Glenn, who's, as I say, is with Mighty Earth now, they did some studies on this, and basically, there's monitoring of deforestation, and way back in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, up until that point where these no deforestation commitments emerged, deforestation in Indonesia was 800,000, 900,000, 1 million hectares per year. And earlier was it earlier this year? Last year, I think, actually, it was last year around the time, because last year was the 10-year anniversary of the Wilmar commitment. It had dropped to about 15 to 20,000 hectares a year. And for those of us who are following in St Barb's footsteps, that's 20,000 hectares too much. But what an incredible turnaround. And a lot of that was because the government in Indonesia saw that this was good for industry and that they actually then made laws to level the playing field. So there was a period after Wilmar where there was a lot of outcry from the palm oil industry saying, oh, these people aren't buying our oil anymore. And Wilmar and the other companies that were starting to follow in their footsteps were able to say to the Indonesian government, look, it's just not good for palm oil to be linked to this deforestation. It's not great. It's certainly not good for palm oil in Indonesia because everyone just goes to Malaysia. We need to, and there was deforestation in Malaysia too, but Indonesia was the frontier. And so the government put in place laws that really did bring it under control. And so, I'm sitting here thinking, that's pretty amazing, to go from around 1 million hectares, 800,000 to 1 million hectares a year down to 15 to 20,000 is quite extraordinary. So that's something that feels good. On the scary side is when governments change, and we've just had a change of government in Indonesia, policies and laws can change. I don't think we've seen that yet. I'm not watching on a day-to-day basis, but we saw that in Brazil with the Bolsonaro government, who weakened a lot of the controls that were protecting and reducing deforestation in the Amazon. So we haven't seen that. I haven't heard that happening in Indonesia yet with the new president, but let's see, fingers crossed. There are very, very important forests out in West Papua, amazing areas there that haven't been deforested yet. So but there's a lot of companies out there looking to do that, and some deforestation has happened, and Mighty Earth have been putting that out there so people know. The campaign, and then the EUDR now is another wonderful lever to force companies, because people say, they sell the palm oil to China. Yes, but what if the palm oil then finds its way to Europe in a product? Of course, there's a lot of palm oil used in China and India where they don't have such regulations. But most of the companies who are growing palm oil don't just sell to China and India. They do sell to Europe. And if they, and the company, not just
You're
Europe.
hopeful for this deforestation law that just came into
I hope so.
Europe for a number of supply chains, a number of products.
Yes.
You have to start showing full transparency, which to your credit probably wouldn't have been on the table 20 plus years ago. And if you don't, and if you are linked to deforestation, the fees are pretty intense on your revenue in Europe, which for some of these companies is. So it seems to have teeth. From what I hear, it seems to have teeth. And I see everybody scrambling for.
That's right.
Like, okay, let's show which farm we get our cacao from. Let's farm, because people, I don't think we understand that. We have no clue in many cases how these work. And it seems to have teeth, which is good, because a nice law without any teeth is not going to go anywhere. So, but it's going to influence hopefully markets outside Europe as well. As you said, these companies also sell their products into India, etc. Are you going to separate those streams? Like, what are you going to do? Or are you just going to work on the whole thing?
They work on the whole thing, and that's why it's got teeth, and that's why it's exciting. And I think, before these companies came along because when we started in the palm oil industry, there was no traceability. The ships would just go up and down the coast, stopping at a port where there was a mill, taking the oil from the tank, go to the next one. And they had no idea what was happening inland from that tank. Was there deforestation? Was there human rights abuses? And so this push for traceability. In the TFT, we developed what we call this. We developed it in hindsight. We didn't develop it going in. But, first off, we'd say to the companies, what are your values? Like, do you want to be linked to the death of orangutans? Do you want to be linked to human rights abuses? No, that's not who we are. Well, who are you? And that's why we'd come with these policies, these no deforestation, no exploitation, no peatland policies. So that was the setting out of their values. And the next thing was T for transparency, T for traceability. Well, how are you going against that policy? These suppliers are doing well, but these suppliers you've got no idea about. So then comes T for transformation. So get in there and help those suppliers who aren't doing well meet your policy. And people would say, well, shouldn't we just disengage from these people? It's like, well, no, we want to keep economic development happening out there. So it's really the balance. But let's transform through engagement. Let's not think that if we just disengage with these people, they're going to suddenly transform their operations. They need help. This was the founding principle of the TFT, right? Let's help companies. Let's not assume they're all evil.
Not divest.
Yeah, let's not
divest.
exactly.
Yeah.
Let's not assume they're all evil. Let's assume that that's just the way the industry is running. And if we came in and said, well, listen, we could do it differently, that can address these issues, and you can be in business, they people, okay, help me, show me how to do that. And so we've seen this transformation unfold through engagement, not by boycotts. And the last V was, V for verification. Let's make sure it's working. Let's not just, listen to what people tell us. Let's make sure it's working. So this sort of VTTV model that TFT developed through our work and is now, I don't know, when I stepped aside as TFT CEO, we were working in 25 different commodities. I don't know how many they're working on now, but and of course, they're looking a lot at soil regeneration and things like this, which is Bastian's strong passion, whereas mine was forests. His is the soils and but they still do the forest. We
discovered
work.
Today they're intimately connected. And earthworms and goats.
Exactly, that's right. So that's at least part of the journey, and it gives me a lot of joy to see these things come, because when I first started, people just saw the businesses as major part of the problem, and I was like, no. They are a big part of the solution. And of course, we need legislation to bring up the laggards and everything, but we need leaders. And I think our work in those years was all about helping these companies move away from being considered to be pariahs and actually become leaders. And they have done, and they continue to be, which is good.
There's so many rabbit holes, but I also want to be conscious of your time. So, okay, let's see how we're going to do this. A short question, but it might lead to a massive answer. Like, have you been following the health side of things, like the human health? We see ultra-processed foods coming out of Brazil, and now a massive book in the UK. Like, there seems to be a lot of bubbling around unhealthy food, ultra-processed foods, which has in essence a lot of palm oil in it usually, and a lot of other things that are commodities, hugely processed, etc. Do you have you ever looked into that? Do you see, like, with your emergency glasses on, because you've been really good at seeing that, not running after ambulances, but seeing that, do you see something else bubbling there, and an opportunity to move to healthier products, not just healthier, let's say environmentally and socially better, better change, value change, but actually healthier products in the end? Long answer. I don't know if you have long question. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the health side of things.
Yeah, well, it was one of the sticks that the NGOs used to beat the palm oil industry with way back, in 2007, 8, 9, 10, even beyond. Oh, actually palm oil, it's really bad for you. And of course, there were plenty of studies out there to suggest that it really wasn't the worst oil that you could use. And I always talk about the palm oil dilemma, because having been out into places like in rural Indonesia and else in Africa, in Latin America, palm oil has been an economic miracle to lift millions and millions, tens of millions of people out of poverty, deep entrenched poverty. And that's a good thing. And it's bringing infrastructure, health, school, education, sanitation, infrastructure into places where they didn't exist before. But of course, it's had this environmental and social problems, and the social problem being around, slave labour, forced labour, things like that. So the palm oil industry's done a lot of work to protect itself. And in those days, I looked at those health issues. I'm like, that's sort of number 10 down the list. Let's not worry about that. You're just beating the palm oil companies up for another reason, right? There's far more other things we've got to worry about than that. But it sort of lingered. And to the point now, of course, where, yes, the ultra-processed food discussion has emerged with some pretty scary data associated with it and health problems for people. And of course, yes, so much of that food has got palm oil in it.
I'm not saying that palm oil is the issue in that food. I'm saying that the ultra-processed part of palm oil is the issue in the food.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting that it's usually among, one of its derivatives is among the ingredient list of 35 plus things.
Yes, absolutely right. And that's a concern. It's a concern for me for the palm oil industry in a way. And people will say, you care about the palm oil industry? Well, if looking, putting my glasses on and looking ahead 5 to 10 years, there's so much research now going into alternatives to palm oil around bacteria or oil from bacteria, algae, all of these things. And of course, if you go out to these places in Africa and in Asia in particular, you see all these we did for a long while, old rubber plantations. Natural rubber's has made a bit of a comeback. So rubber plantations are coming back. But you saw these communities going up and down and in terms of their economic livelihoods with the boom and bust of these raw material cycles. And I think that the palm oil industry has cleared so much forest. What a disaster if the palm oil industry is laid low and can't continue to function and give people work, economic development, because an alternative comes along, particularly in places where they really have done the work to reduce the deforestation. You can't really beat up on palm oil from that perspective now. So what a shame if something else comes along and destroys the economic livelihoods of those millions and millions of people who depend on palm oil. So I think it is a risk, and the ultra-processed food question is a risk. But at the same time, the amazing thing about palm oil, and I don't know what the figures are now, but when I was looking at it back then, 10 years or so ago, it was, average industrial yield of a palm oil plantation was around 8 tonnes of oil per hectare, whereas soy and rapeseed oil and these things, canola oil, these are like 1.2. And so to feed the billions of people we have on the planet, we need palm oil. And I suspect it's higher now as they've done a lot of research and development on it. What else could they use it for? Of course, now it gets used as in biofuels. Is that a good thing? I'm not sure. If it leads to more deforestation, that's not great. If it can help us with our carbon problem, perhaps it is good. But what about feeding people? Because if they're not, there's so many things that are intertwined, right? So that's not a really good way of answering your question. It's just I would say that I hope that the palm oil industry, we don't need it to massively grow and clear more land, no. But if they can become more productive and lift more people out of poverty, this is a good thing. But for that, we need a market for the palm oil. And, in smallholder farmers in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they could do with having a market for palm oil because it does lift them out of poverty. And if they're out of poverty, they may not go back and chop down other forests and do things like this. So it's all interlinked. So, yeah, I personally eat as much of a whole food diet as I can because of the health issues around ultra-processed food. This is something that I've seen for years. But, I hope these industries can weather that storm and maybe even be part of the solution. Because if it's not ultra-processed palm oil, maybe that's not a bad thing. It doesn't seem to have those negative health things.
I think the question is that, can it be part of a healthy diet?
Yes, that's the question.
And in what way, and with how many other ingredients?
Yes.
But it's it seems like there's a storm building. I think that's the feeling.
I think you're right.
I get, and there might be. Yeah, I think how you grow the palm oil, what kind of it's an interesting fat, and we need fat. So that one of the reasons, but it also has been ultra processed in so many different forms and shapes, unrecognizable to the original oil. And it turned out to be a cheap filling for many places, and then it goes wrong. So it's going to be very interesting how that unfolds, because regulation will come, because the health issues are just getting completely out of control now.
Yes.
Already for many years, but somehow, I don't know why, but it's hitting a nerve now, just as we discussed before with the orangutans and with garden furniture. I want to be conscious of your time and ask a few questions we always like to ask at the end or through the interview, but in this case at the end. If you had, let's start with a question like that, like looking at the investor side, people that are managing money and managing wealth, maybe their own, maybe other people's money. Let's say we're in the city of London, in the theatre, or in Geneva, close to where you are. And we have an evening around regeneration, forests, earthworms, supply chains, etc. But if there's one thing you want them to remember after they walk out, of course they're inspired and they're fired up. But next day they go back to work, and you would like one seed to be planted in their mind of financial professionals, people managing resources and money for work. What would that be?
Due diligence. Go out and have a look in the bush. Too many decisions are taken with glossy reports coming in from someone who probably hasn't been to the bush themselves, and billions of dollars go into projects that aren't properly thought through, aren't properly designed. They sound all pretty exciting. They can have a great ROI, rate of return, and all these sort of things on them, return on investment. But they just don't hang. They don't hang together. And the key thing, and we haven't got to it, Cohen, but I've been working the last couple of years on a regenerative agriculture project in Ghana with smallholder farmers, and the investor and the company that's leading that work have gone in absolutely focused on trying to have a regenerative approach on soils and very much on the communities there. These impoverished farmers have been destroyed by our traditional agricultural system, and their soils have been destroyed and their lives have been destroyed. So if you go into those situations, you don't just need a 1 or 2 page prospectus. And so many, and that's the tragedy of it, because I think there are investors. There are a lot of impact investors out there who put impact in their title but don't really care. It's all about ROI. But for those that do, worst case scenario is that they invest in a project and lose their money. But not just lose their money, they lose the opportunity to bring change. And I think what I always say, when people say, how was TFT so successful? How has Earthworm continued to be successful today? My new foundation is Pond Foundation. How did you get things happening in Ghana? Got to go out into the bush. So, I used to, as the TFT CEO, I was in the forests of Indonesia. I was in the farms. I was in the plantations. I was in the factories, as were all my team and colleagues. We knew what was going on. So when we got into those discussions with the boards of the companies way downstream in the supply chain, or their investors, we could say X, Y, Z, this is what's going on, this is what you need to do, boom, boom, boom. And I think too many of these investors who want to get involved and want to do good things don't get that information in a good way. I say, from the bush to the boardroom, you've got to get information from the bush to the decision makers so that they can make wise choices about where they put their money, how they put their money, who they put their money with. All of these questions are really important, and so much money gets wasted, and also opportunities get lost and people get hurt in that process. I've seen it in Ghana. The farmers there saying, why are you guys going to be any different from all of these other jokers that have come along? And it's a pretty good challenge, and it's a pretty valid challenge. I'm like, well, let's just see. We hear you, and we're going to try to be different. We can make all the promises that you've heard before, but let's see what happens. And so that's what I'd say to investors. Get someone, and this is not just a plug for work for me, but get out in the bush. Get someone to go out in the bush and deeply understand what's going on out there. Of course, you'll never truly understand it until you put a spade in the soil and start working. Then you'll learn so much more. But do more due diligence so that, projects have a greater opportunity to be successful. And we need these projects to be successful. The world needs them to work.
And if we would flip the question and put you in charge of an investment fund, let's say $1 billion or €1 billion, a significant amount of money, not unlimited, obviously, but a lot of money. What would you focus on? What would be high prioritization areas? Would it be satellite monitoring? Would it be like supply chain work? Would it set up brands? What would you focus on if you had to put this money to work for a very long time? Could be long time horizons, return horizons, but it has to be put to work to generate a financial return at some point.
I would go to particularly Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but not just there. I would go to the tropics and I would invest in biochar. I would invest getting biochar up and running.
I have the feeling we need to do a second interview. Yeah, this is going to open a whole other rabbit hole.
Absolutely, and I have seen the impact of biochar. When I got to Ghana in February I got there first end of November 2021, and all of the people were burning their peanut shells and their corn cobs, just burning them. I'm like, why aren't you making biochar? And they go, bio what? Sorry?
Do you remember the first time you encountered biochar, like basically burning trees partly?
Yeah, well, of course, charcoal is a pyrolysis process. It's exactly the same. But
when you discovered, when did the light bulb go on?
The light bulb went for me at the end of, let me now just be accurate on that. I'm going to say...
Doesn't have to be a day, but also the moment.
2019.
Like, were you in the forest?
No. I had someone contact me who was making biochar in Cambodia, and they said, we want to talk about... I don't know what they wanted to talk about, quite honestly. They contacted me and I'm like, and I knew about biochar, but I saw what they were doing with their project in Cambodia and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. Not only are you helping farmers increase their yields, you're really reducing the amount of fertilizer that they're using, which has all sorts of benefits to the soil and the aquatic ecology around these farms.
And emissions.
And by the way, you're putting carbon back in the ground where it's going to be for probably at least 100, if not 1,000 years. This is extraordinary. How do we take this to scale? So when I got to Africa, so I then read about it, and Husk is the company in Cambodia, a social enterprise. They became our first Pond Foundation partner, and we were selling. They'd never sold a carbon credit, and I'm like, you need to sell this stuff, make money out of it. And they've now gone to scale, selling carbon credits and investing in a whole new factory to go to scale. I bought their first ever carbon credit. And when I went to, and so I read about it, I learned about it, I'm like, oh my God. And when I went to Ghana and saw these farmers who were I've worked in India, I've worked all over the world. I've traveled to 60 countries, I've worked in 30. These are some of the poorest people I've met in my entire life, and they can't afford fertilizer, and they get ripped off by traders. We could really talk about this a lot, Kane, but they're burning their peanut shells. I'm like, why don't you make biochar, guys? And not just the soy thrash, the corn cobs, they're just burning it, putting it up into smoke. Not even in their fields. They would bring it from the fields and burn it in their community. I'm like, oh my God. So we did some tests, and sure enough, we saw with our Bambara beans project that we were growing, in the first year, we just put some biochar, 26% yield increase, just with biochar alone. And then last year, we did a trial with Bambara, which unfortunately, we didn't end up being able to harvest it for various reasons. But in the meantime, we did a little corn trial, corn with biochar, corn with chicken manure. And, on these desperately impoverished soils, we saw, what was it now? I think it was a 20% increase on the corn yield with just biochar, and a 98% increase with the biochar and manure, just on a little corn plot.
Wow.
I mean, this is extraordinary. There were no other regenerative agricultural practices. I mean, they didn't spray any fertilizer, any chemicals, no weeding, no herbicides. 98% yield increase. I mean, talking about feeding the population, it's just incredible achievement. Now it's not, and we're looking at now what we can do with the project.
It's not a magic solution. It's not a goal.
It's hard work.
We talked about it before. Let's not.
Yeah, it's not magic.
Go down that road.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not magic. It's hard work.
It's needed.
It's hard work, and there's all sorts of logistics, and getting the biomass in, and
quality,
all of those things. Yeah. So my goodness, it's not just like the world needs biochar, but mate, if I had $1 billion, I'd be out there in strategic places trying to plant the seeds of getting some biochar machines up and running, and working with the farmers so that we can demonstrate and learn because there's so much learning to be done about biochar because, it's like a forgotten technology, ancient but forgotten. Let's learn about it and let's see what we can do here. That would be what I would do.
And there are probably some others, like we're going to do an input series soon, little plug for us, but together with John Kemp, and we're going to explore, because there are so many of these ancient and new technologies, like literally in the broader sense of technology, around fascinating inputs that can really make a huge difference. And the compost tea and the extracts and the biofertilizers, and the biochars, like there's this massive opening world, it seems like, and just putting a stone, as we learned at the beginning of this conversation, like massive potential when you start replacing chemical with biology.
That's right.
Understanding, and we only literally scratch the surface, pun intended. But there's so much else there with new lab technology. We can see, we can understand, we can start to see, okay, how do we speed this up, and how do we bring extremely impoverished soils? Let's not forget, most of the world is in that situation, unfortunately, for various reasons. How do we bring that to life at speed? Because we don't have time. And which is a nice bridge to my last question. If you had a magic wand and you were able to change one thing overnight, what would that be?
I would get rid of all the chemical fertilizers. And
overnight.
You know why? And I thought about this. Of course, overnight's a bit dramatic, but we don't change until we have a crisis. That's the underlying lesson of my work. None of these companies that are now leading the way in no deforestation commitments would have done that unless someone hung off their building and shamed them publicly. Humans.
So for any investors out there and lobbyists, like this, we can make fun of it, but this is also fundamental work that needs to be funded. I'm not saying go out there and fund Greenpeace, I'm not advising, but Mighty Earth, Greenpeace, there's a whole slew of like this kind of disruption is needed.
It's critical.
Sorry for the plug.
Absolutely correct. And I'm glad you did mention that, because of course, at TFT we worked with companies who weren't being campaigned against. But when we moved the needle, and we were part of a process that transformed the entire palm oil industry, Indonesia's pulp and paper industry, the garden furniture industry, the teak furniture industry in Indonesia. We haven't touched on that. We got 4,000 semi-automatic weapons out of the hands of rangers that were regularly used to kill people. These are all and the Congo Basin forest industry. It wasn't until Greenpeace went ballistic and campaigned against them that they changed. These NGOs are agents, and Glenn Horowitz. I don't know what's happened to Greenpeace. They seem to have disappeared. But Glenn Horowitz with Mighty Earth, they are still rattling cages, and it makes people uncomfortable. It's only when people are uncomfortable that we have an opportunity to change. And of course, if overnight the chemical fertilizer industry disappeared, it would be probably a crisis. And so I do acknowledge that. However, my golly, would it accelerate the changes that we really do need? And that would happen quickly, because a lot of this technology, as you just mentioned, the ancient technology, it's there, but it's been pushed aside and lobbied out of the way by the chemical fertilizer industry and the pesticide industry.
Do you want to starve everybody? That's the narrative being used.
Exactly.
Like, you must be in favor of starving
What
people.
is wrong with you? And honestly, mate, some of the chemicals that I'm seeing sprayed in Ghana, these are just awful.
Illegal in most other
illegal
places.
in most, often they are illegal, and this is an outrage. And the farmers are sick for 3 days after they spray them. And these products end up in global supply chains, not just in Ghanaian stomachs. I see the suffering of the Ghanaian farmers and their soils. And so for me, regenerative agriculture, I don't just talk about agriculture, regenerative supply chains are all about, for me, I start with the people. Because, the soils are obviously fundamental to the whole process, but if the people aren't supported and motivated, inspired to do it in the right way, well, you're not going to get there. And when I see these farmers and the gross exploitation that has impoverished them and has them living in starvation, let's work on that and support them to bring regeneration back to their soils. And so there's so many forces that are operating against that, and all led by money and lobbyists from the chemical industries. So there's my magic wand moment. Let's just get rid of it quickly. Work hard to get more regenerative practices in place. And by golly, of course there'd be some suffering, so we don't want that. But let's basically wave the magic wand and say, in the next 6 months, it's all gone. Give you a bit of time, but get ready because it's gone. Wow, that would transform our planet.
I think it's a perfect end to this conversation. So many other rabbit holes to go into, which we'll do in another episode. But let's bring it to a close now. I know I want to be conscious of your time. I know you have to go to another call. I want to give you a few minutes to prepare for that because this was a long one. But very, very, very interesting. Joram was absolutely right. We had to talk and record.
Well, thank you,
so
Cohen.
we did. So thank you for the work you do, for sharing fascinating insights, and people will be here until the end. I hope they had a cup of tea in the meantime, or a nice long walk or run or commute, or cooking or gardening or whatever people are doing when they're listening to this. Definitely write me. I always love it when people write where they're listening. But I want to thank you so much for coming on here, Scott, and share your journey.
Thank you very much for asking, mate. I've really enjoyed talking with you and travelling that journey again and again with your interesting questions. Good on you.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.